Good morning, it's August 9th, and this is to my liberal friends. How much debt can we continue to accumulate? How much will finally be too much? At what point will we finally realize that we have mortgaged the nation's future because of our greed to have the government give us things today? These are all important questions, and they seem to fall on deaf ears in our nation's capital. For the past 20 plus years, we've been on a spending binge that seems to have no ending. It's hard to blame one party more than another because both have been complicit in the spending spree. Republicans are supposed to be the ones that try to insist on fiscal responsibility, but even when they've had control of the government, the deficits continue to soar and that national debt goes higher and higher. Every week we break new records, and despite negotiated agreements on how to raise the debt limit, there seems to be no way to bring our budget into some form of balance and even start reducing that debt. Joe Biden brags about reducing the deficit by the most in history in a single year. Of course, he fails to mention that he raised the yearly deficit so high it had to come down. But even when he curtails spending, it still raised the national debt by an astronomical number. And if you think there's some restraint, I would only point you toward the figures being put out by the Congressional Budget Office in their monthly review. We just got the numbers for July, and for the first 10 months of the fiscal year, we've racked up a deficit of $1.62 trillion. That's a full $726 billion more than a year ago at the same point in the previous fiscal year. The last time we had a balanced budget was under President Clinton, and the only reason we had it was Congress was controlled by Republicans in both the House and Senate, and Clinton was forced to rein in spending because Congress would not appropriate the money. Under President Obama, deficits fell after Republicans gained control of the House in 2010. But listen to that carefully. The deficits went down, but they were still deficits, and the national debt still grew. The CBO lays out the gory details. Revenues have fallen about 10% this year, despite the Democrats' increase in corporate taxes. Individual income tax revenues down 20%, or about $442 billion. And the CBO speculates one reason is smaller capital gain realizations. Soaking the rich doesn't work when the rich aren't making money in the markets. Outlays are up 11% so far this year, or $473 billion, and they would have been higher at $536 billion without shifts in payment timing. Spending lowlights included $71 billion more for Mr. Biden's latest student loan non-repayment plan, $111 billion more for Social Security, largely for cost of living adjustments for inflation, and $104 billion for Medicare from higher payment rates and more care. And it won't get any better next year because with the current rates of inflation, Social Security beneficiaries can expect another increase between 4 and 5%. So where are we spending this money? The taxpayers are on the hook for $52 billion for the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank and some other banks. Now we can recoup some of those funds from the sale of assets and of course higher premiums for deposit insurance, but we won't get it all back. It'll just be added to the deficit and then the national debt. All of us have watched interest rates being increased over and over in an effort to tame inflation. The result is the highest interest rates we've seen in decades, and this has led to a huge increase in outlays to pay the interest on the national debt. That interest has risen by 34% and totaled $572 billion. And if we keep borrowing and interest rates stay high, that total will keep increasing, and we get no goods and services from the government for that payment. Interest on the debt this year has climbed to 15.5% of all federal revenue, and most of the 10 months through July were well before interest rates hit their current levels. Interest payments keep soaring, and as Treasury is scheduled to issue $1 trillion in new debt at higher rates in the current fiscal quarter. Much more debt will be needed to finance the Biden spending binge that has only begun for the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the infrastructure bill. These are programs that Biden touts as part of his Bidenomics campaign. These are spending programs that have just begun and will need more and more cash to keep them funded at the levels Democrats passed them during the first 2 years of the Biden administration when they controlled the House and Senate. If Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema had not put some form of a check on their spending, we'd be looking at much larger numbers. If you want to put this in some perspective that's easy to understand, let me use these numbers. The federal government collected about $5 trillion in fiscal year 22. That comes to about $15,098 per person. That sounds like a lot of money, but the federal government then spent $6.5 trillion, which comes out to $19,434 per person. And that equated to a deficit of $1.4 trillion. And the number's going to be higher in fiscal year 23. So I go back to my original question. How much debt can we continue to accumulate? How much will finally be too much? And at one point, will we finally realize that we have mortgaged the nation's future because of our greed to have the government give us things today? There's no easy answers, and the solution is not raising taxes. It may have to be part of the solution, but in the end, we will have to wean ourselves off the government teat, and that means cutting spending. We need to realize it's just because we like the stuff, we get it's not really free. Someone has to pay the bill, and the truth is those will be our children and grandchildren. It's not sustainable, and politicians on both sides of the aisle need to quit looking at how to spend money and instead start looking at how they can cut spending. This has been To My Liberal Friends. I appreciate your listening. If you enjoy the podcast, hit the subscribe button and recommend it to your friends.